Across the United States, Great Lakes and reservoirs hold the water that sustains cities, farms, and entire regions, vast bodies of water that store the supply on which tens of millions of people depend. For generations, these lakes have seemed permanent, reliable, unchanging, a dependable foundation for the life built around them. But something is happening to them, something that has begun to alarm the scientists and the officials who watch them, because the lakes America depends on are shrinking, their waters are falling, their shorelines retreating, their once full basins exposing rings of bare rock and stretches of dry ground where water used to be. And here is the most unsettling part of the story, the part that makes this more than just another tale of drought. Nobody knows how far they will fall. The forces driving the decline are complex and still unfolding. The future is uncertain, and the people who study these lakes cannot say with confidence where the bottom lies. This is the story of the shrinking lakes of America, of why they are falling, and of the deep uncertainty about how far the decline will go. Before we begin, one honest word. To say the lakes are shrinking and that nobody knows how far they will fall does not mean they will vanish entirely, or that catastrophe is certain. It means these vital bodies of water are under real stress, that their future is genuinely uncertain, and that understanding their plight is the first step toward protecting the water on which so much depends. Quick honest word before we dive in. A lot of people watch these all the way through, love them, and forget the one small thing that keeps a channel like ours going: hitting subscribe. If you are finding this important, take 1 second and subscribe right now. It genuinely matters for us and costs you nothing. And drop your state in the comments so we can see who is watching. Alright, let's begin. Why the lakes are falling and the future is uncertain. Before we visit the lakes themselves, it helps to understand why they are shrinking and, crucially, why the future is so uncertain. Because it is the uncertainty, as much as the decline, that makes this story so unsettling. The lakes are falling because of a combination of forces, each of which is difficult to predict. There is drought, the prolonged dry weather that reduces the water flowing into the lakes, and that has gripped large parts of the country for years. There is the warming of the climate, which increases the evaporation of water from the surface of the lakes and reduces the snow and rain that feed them, a persistent force that operates year after year. And there is demand, the ever-growing thirst of the cities and farms that draw water from the lakes, taking more than the lakes can sustainably provide. Each of these forces is difficult to predict, and together they make the future of the lakes deeply uncertain. Nobody can say for certain how long the drought will last, how much the climate will warm, or how the demand for water will change, and so nobody can say with confidence how far the lakes will fall. The scientists who study them can describe the trends and the pressures, but the future depends on forces that cannot be foreseen, and the lakes could stabilize if the conditions improve, or continue to fall if they worsen. This uncertainty is not a failure of science, but a reflection of the genuine complexity of the situation, of the many forces at work, and the difficulty of predicting them. It means that the people who depend on the lakes are living with a profound not knowing, unable to plan with confidence, because the future of their water is genuinely unclear. The shrinking of the lakes is thus not only a crisis of declining water, but a crisis of uncertainty, and it is this uncertainty that hangs over everything, making the situation so difficult to confront and so unsettling to contemplate. It is worth appreciating why prediction is so hard, because it reveals the true nature of the challenge. The level of a lake depends on the balance between the water flowing in and the water going out, and both sides of that balance are governed by forces that are themselves difficult to foresee. The water flowing in depends on the rain and the snow, which vary from year to year in ways that cannot be predicted far in advance, and which are being reshaped by a warming climate whose future course is itself uncertain. The water going out depends on evaporation, which rises with the temperature, and on the demand of the cities and farms, which changes with the population and the economy. With so many uncertain forces at work on both sides of the balance, the future level of a lake becomes genuinely difficult to predict, and the honest answer to how far the lakes will fall is that nobody truly knows. The great reservoirs of the Colorado begin with the most famous of America's shrinking lakes, the two great reservoirs of the Colorado River, the largest in the country. which store the water that sustains tens of millions of people across the arid Southwest. These enormous artificial lakes were built to hold several years' worth of the river's flow, a vast reserve designed to guarantee a reliable supply even through dry years, and for much of their history, they were kept relatively full, a comfortable buffer against uncertainty. They are the savings account of the West, the stored water that allows the region to weather the natural ups and downs of the river, and the foundation on which the great desert cities and farms were built. But these reservoirs have been shrinking dramatically, drawn down by the sustained decline of the river under drought, warming, and overuse, until they have fallen to levels that would have seemed impossible a generation ago, reaching historic lows and exposing the pale bathtub rings that have become symbols of the crisis. And the deeply unsettling question is how far they will fall, because they have approached the thresholds at which their great dams can no longer generate power, and below that, the levels at which water can no longer pass through the dams at all, a catastrophic scenario that would sever the supply to everyone downstream. Nobody knows for certain whether the reservoirs will stabilize or continue to fall toward these critical levels, because the answer depends on the drought, the climate, and the choices of the region, all of them uncertain. The great reservoirs of the Colorado are the clearest example of the shrinking lakes and the uncertainty that surrounds them, vast bodies of water that millions depend on, falling toward levels that were once unthinkable, with no one able to say how far the decline will go. What makes the uncertainty around these reservoirs so acute is that their decline does not necessarily proceed at a steady, predictable pace, but can accelerate as they fall, because of the shape of the basins that hold them. Near the top, where the reservoir is wide, a given loss of water lowers the surface only slightly, but as the water falls into the narrower parts of the basin, the same loss causes the surface to drop more quickly, so that the decline can seem to speed up as the reservoir empties. This means that the closer the reservoirs come to their critical thresholds, the faster they can approach them, adding to the difficulty of predicting their future and to the urgency of the situation. The people who manage these reservoirs watch their levels with the closest attention, running their models and making their forecasts, but the fundamental uncertainty remains, because the future depends on forces beyond anyone's control, on the rain and the snow and the choices of millions of people, none of which can be foreseen with confidence. The great reservoirs thus embody the central theme of this story, the combination of a real and serious decline with a deep and genuine uncertainty about where it will end. Here is something I would genuinely love to know, and it takes 10 seconds. Did you have any idea that the largest reservoirs in the country have fallen to historic lows? Drop a yes or no in the comments, because your answers help us understand what surprises people most, and I read every reply. Okay, back to the lakes. The Great Salt Lake and its alarming retreat, our second shrinking lake, is the Great Salt Lake in Utah, one of the most iconic bodies of water in the West, whose alarming retreat has become a powerful symbol of the crisis facing America's lakes. The Great Salt Lake is a vast inland sea, fed by the rivers and streams that flow down from the mountains, and it has no outlet to the ocean, so that its level reflects the balance between the water flowing in and the water lost to evaporation. As the region has grown, more and more of the water that would naturally flow into the lake has been diverted for use by the cities and the farms. And as the climate has warmed and the drought has deepened, the lake has fallen to strikingly low levels, exposing vast stretches of dry lake bed where water once stood. The retreat of the Great Salt Lake is alarming not only for the loss of the water, but for the dangers that the exposed lake bed creates, because the dry bed can release dust, some of it laden with harmful materials, that the wind can carry into the populated areas nearby, threatening the health of the people who live there. The shrinking of the lake also threatens the ecosystem that depends on it, the birds and the brine shrimp and the whole web of life adapted to the salty waters, and the industries and the way of life built around the lake. And here again, nobody knows how far the lake will fall, because its future depends on how much water is allowed to flow into it, on the drought and the climate, and on the choices of the region, all of them uncertain. The Great Salt Lake, retreating year by year and exposing its dangerous bed, is a vivid example of the shrinking lakes of America and of the deep uncertainty about their future. A great inland sea, whose decline is a warning of what can happen when the water that feeds a lake is drawn away faster than nature can replace it. The case of the Great Salt Lake is especially instructive because it shows how the shrinking of a lake can create dangers that reach far beyond the water itself into the very air that people breathe. As the lake bed is exposed and dries, the fine dust it releases can travel on the wind into the cities and towns nearby, carrying with it whatever materials have accumulated in the lake over the years, and posing a threat to the health of a large population. This transforms the shrinking of the lake from a matter of water supply into a matter of public health, adding a new and troubling dimension to the crisis. And because the lake sits near a large and growing population, the potential impact of its dust is considerable, a hazard that grows with every foot the lake falls. The Great Salt Lake thus illustrates that the shrinking of a lake is not a single problem, but a cascade of them, reaching from the water to the ecosystem to the air and the health of the people. And it is a powerful reminder of how much can be at stake in the decline of a single body of water. The Salton Sea and the poison in the dust, our third shrinking lake, is the Salton Sea in California, a body of water with a strange and troubled history, whose shrinking has created one of the most difficult environmental problems in the country. The Salton Sea is a large lake in the desert of Southern California, and for many years it was sustained largely by the runoff from the surrounding agriculture. But as that flow has diminished and the lake has shrunk, it has exposed a growing expanse of dry lake bed. And this exposed bed has become a source of serious concern. The lake bed contains the accumulated residue of decades, including the chemicals and materials that have washed into the lake over the years, and as it dries and is exposed to the wind, it can release dust laden with these harmful materials into the air, threatening the health of the communities nearby. The shrinking of the Salton Sea is thus not only the loss of a lake, but the creation of a growing hazard, as the exposed bed releases its poisonous dust into a region already burdened by poor air quality. The lake also supports an ecosystem, including the birds that depend on it, and its decline threatens this life as well. And as with the other shrinking lakes, the future of the Salton Sea is uncertain, its fate depending on the water that is allowed to flow into it, and on the efforts to manage the exposed bed and to mitigate the dangers, all of them uncertain and difficult. The Salton Sea is a particularly troubling example of the shrinking lakes, because its decline creates not only a loss of water, but an active danger, a growing expanse of toxic dust that threatens the health of the people nearby, and it is a reminder that the shrinking of a lake can have consequences far beyond the water itself, reaching into the air, the health, and the well-being of the communities that surround it. The efforts to address the Salton Sea have proven difficult and costly, precisely because the problem is so complex and the future so uncertain, and the challenge of managing the exposed bed, of controlling the dust, and of deciding how much water to devote to the lake has no easy answer. It stands as a cautionary tale of what can happen when a lake is allowed to shrink without a clear plan for the consequences, and of how much harder it is to manage a crisis once it has already unfolded than to prevent it in the first place. Quick pause, because this matters and deserves to be seen. If you are getting value from this, tap the like button. It really does help the video reach more people. And if you have family or friends who care about where their water comes from, share this with them, because it is genuinely important to understand. One like, one share to someone you care about, and let's keep going. Even the Great Lakes are not immune. Our fourth stop takes us to the largest lakes of all, the Great Lakes of the Upper Midwest, which hold a staggering share of the world's fresh water and which supply the drinking water for tens of millions of people, and which illustrate a different dimension of the uncertainty facing America's lakes. The Great Lakes are so vast that they seem utterly immune to the kind of shrinking that afflicts the lakes of the West, and in terms of their sheer size. They are indeed in a different category, holding an almost unimaginable quantity of water. But even the Great Lakes are not entirely immune to change, because their levels rise and fall over time, and in a warming climate, they face their own uncertainties, with the potential for greater swings between high and low levels driven by the changing patterns of precipitation, evaporation, and ice cover. The uncertainty facing the Great Lakes is less about a steady decline, like that of the western reservoirs, and more about increasing variability, the potential for their levels to swing more dramatically between high and low, in ways that are difficult to predict, and that can cause problems at both extremes. When the levels fall, shipping can be disrupted, shorelines exposed, and water intakes threatened. When they rise, flooding and erosion can damage the communities along the shores. The changing climate makes these swings harder to predict, adding to the uncertainty about the future of even these vast lakes. And so the Great Lakes, for all their enormous size, illustrate that the uncertainty facing America's lakes is not confined to the shrinking reservoirs of the West, but reaches even the largest bodies of fresh water in the country, in the form of an increasing unpredictability that makes their future harder to foresee. The Great Lakes are a reminder that the challenge facing America's lakes is not only decline, but uncertainty. The growing difficulty of knowing what the future holds for the waters on which so many depend. All right, I know, second time I am bringing this up, feel free to sigh at me. But quickly, if you have made it this deep into a video about America's lakes, you clearly care about this stuff, and a lot of you who watch have not subscribed yet. That one tap genuinely tips the scales for a small channel like ours. No guilt, just a grateful ask. That is the last time. Promise, let's finish. Living with the not knowing. Having traveled across the country, from the great reservoirs of the Colorado to the retreating Great Salt Lake, from the troubled Salton Sea to the vast Great Lakes, we can step back and consider what it means to live with the deep uncertainty that surrounds the shrinking lakes of America. The first and most important truth is that the uncertainty itself is a central part of the challenge, because it is not only that the lakes are falling, but that nobody knows how far they will fall, and this not knowing makes it far harder to plan, to prepare, and to respond. The people who depend on the lakes cannot count on a stable supply, cannot easily predict the future of their water, and must contend with the possibility that the decline could continue in ways that are difficult to foresee. Living with this uncertainty is one of the defining challenges of the crisis, and it demands a different kind of response than a predictable problem would. The second truth, however, is that uncertainty is not the same as helplessness, and that even in the face of a genuinely unclear future, there is a great deal that can be done to protect the lakes and to prepare for whatever may come. Conservation, the more efficient use of water, can reduce the demand on the lakes and slow their decline, buying time and easing the pressure. The careful management of the water that flows into the lakes, ensuring that enough is allowed to reach them, can help to stabilize their levels. Planning for a range of possible futures, rather than counting on a single predictable outcome, can build the resilience to cope with whatever the future brings. And the effort to address the broader forces driving the decline, the drought, the warming, and the overuse, bears on the long-term fate of the lakes. The uncertainty about how far the lakes will fall is real, and it is unsettling, but it is not a reason for despair, because the choices that people make can still shape the outcome. Slowing the decline, protecting the lakes, and building the resilience to endure. The lakes America depends on are shrinking, and nobody knows how far they will fall, but the future is not yet written, and the actions taken now, in the face of the uncertainty, will help to determine whether these vital waters can be protected for the generations to come. To live with the not knowing is not to surrender to it, but to act wisely in its shadow, doing what can be done to safeguard the lakes even as their future remains unclear. And in that determined action, taken in the face of uncertainty, lies the best hope for the shrinking lakes of America and the millions who depend on them. Perhaps the deepest lesson of these vanishing waters is that the old assumption of permanence, the belief that the lakes would always be there, full and reliable, can no longer be held. The lakes are telling us, in the plain and unmistakable language of their retreating shores and their exposed and dusty beds, that the water we have long taken for granted is both precious and finite, and that its future now depends entirely on the choices we make. To listen to that message and to act on it with wisdom